Hello, my name is Gregory Bratman. I'll be speaking to you today about nature and health, a research agenda and implications for planning. So we here at the Socio-Environmental Research Group are an interdisciplinary group of scientists dedicated to studying the joint contribution of social and environmental factors in relation to health, disparities, and resilience. And I want to think through today how nature contact and nature experience might play a role in this context. So our learning objectives are to discuss theories of underlying causal mechanisms, address equity and the limitations of current approaches, and describe a research agenda for future work. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement of where I am here at the University of Washington. We acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We acknowledge our indigenous connections as well as the histories of dispossession and forced removal that have allowed for the growth and survival of this and so many of our institutions. I'm here to talk to you a bit about a particular lens on nature and health, as well as discuss some research I've conducted and then wrap up with some policy implications for this type of work. And I want to point out that the approach I'll be talking about today is centered around a relationship with nature that does not by any means represent all perspectives or cultural relationships with the land. It is certainly more of a medical model approach, one with a lens of provider and recipient, and its focus is therefore narrow in many respects. I feel it's important to explicitly note that this approach leaves out some of the crucial perspectives that are captured in other work. So I want to point to those limitations and say there's a lot of work to be done in expanding its scope. And before we even begin to talk about the scientific approach itself, there are some other critical foundational points I'd like to note as well. The first is access to nature and how inequitable this access is in our society. This has multiple root causes, many of them stemming from structural, environmental, and institutional racism. One way this manifests is through infrastructure, such as streets and highways designed to act as barriers, and lack of nearby residential green space due to discriminatory redlining and segregation practices that have taken place in our cities and have left behind a built environment with decreased tree canopy coverage, more impervious surfaces, fewer parks, and increased levels of air pollution for low-income communities and communities of color across the United States. This figure centers on Chicago, from a recent paper by Nardone et al., and there are other cities documented in this work as well, demonstrating the inverse relationship between the homeowner's loan corporation grades of A through D, determinations of which were made through racist practices, and tree cover. And these barriers are not only physical, of course, there are social exclusionary barriers as well. These include racist treatment of Black Americans in natural spaces, as we've seen with Christian Cooper in Central Park, and countless other examples, many of which Dr. Jennifer Roberts has done critical work in documenting in her research. Doctors Finney, Byrne, Hoover, Lim, and others write about the ways in which natural spaces in the US are racialized, how people are made to feel out of place and unwelcome in urban parks through white clientele, a lack of appropriate and inclusive signage, experiences of discrimination and fears of persecution, and the importance of engaging disenfranchised voices in addressing power and privilege in US parks and open space. Outdoor groups with BIPOC leaders and membership are working to reclaim their rightful participation and inclusion in these spaces. And as the organizations themselves have begun to publicly recognize, these practices and attitudes are embedded into the origins of such conservation powerhouses as the Sierra Club, dating back to the racist ideologies of their founders, including John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and others. And Dr. J. Drew Lanham has written compellingly about John James Audubon and how the organization that bears his name must reckon with Audubon's legacy for the bird watching and ornithologist communities. It is also critical to acknowledge the fact that these parks and conservation and preservation movements have taken place on stolen and unceded ancestral homelands of Indigenous people and Native Americans who were forced off their lands in the decades or centuries before they became parks. Some NGOs are trying to address this in their publications, even developing new curriculum, such as the Wilderness Society's new publications, but there is a very long way to go. And so these issues and many, many more must be reckoned with, addressed head on, and explicitly discussed. Developing interventions and solutions to these longstanding systemic and institutional factors in the field of nature and health is critical to any future success it can hope to have. And of course, I also want to be clear to point to the fact that BIPOC scholars have been researching and publishing on these issues for decades. I'm not the expert on these issues, but I consider myself an ally, and I am dedicated to supporting these points in the work and contributing to solutions however I can. So as I present the science that I pursue here, I'm looking for ways in which it needs expansion and inclusion in its practices and in participants themselves, as well as the ways in which the approaches will benefit from decolonization and attention to biases that are baked into Western psychological tools and assessments. I do still think there is a role for this science as long as it continues to evolve. It can help us understand one set of ways in which nature contact may benefit psychological well-being and mental health for so many of us. And as we learn more about the causal mechanisms and the many different types of outcomes to which they lead, the science can contribute to the importance of removing structural, social, and other barriers to nature contact. And the need for equitable access becomes all the more pressing, and the urgency and need for solutions is crystal clear. So, in terms of this research, I studied the nexus of ecology, psychology, and other health sciences, examining the ways in which nature experience impacts human well-being, with an emphasis on mental health, including emotion regulation. When I say emotion regulation, I mean basically the way people go about changing their emotions. Some quick background. The world is urbanizing at an unprecedented rate. We recently passed the halfway mark, and we're headed towards close to 70% of the world population living in cities by 2050. Concurrent with this urbanization is another trend, a marked decrease in the rate of nature exposure for people living within urban environments. And a third trend, there's some evidence indicating that some anxiety and mood disorders are on the rise within urban environments, including depression and schizophrenia. Now, of course, correlation does not imply causation, but one way to start to think about possible connections between these three major trends is to consider the repercussions of the environment, including nature experience, on psychological functioning as exposure to nature becomes increasingly rare. With respect to decreased nature exposure on the population level, for example, in the United States, about 80% of our population lives in cities, and we spend more than 90% of our time inside buildings or vehicles. And for those urbanites who do get outdoors, recent studies have shown that a majority of nature contact is experienced by a small portion of that population. And just one example here from Southern England, these researchers found that 75% of the total time in nature was experienced by just 32% of the population. So work is now underway across a variety of disciplines to try to understand what the repercussions are of this shift in our daily experience. Now, of course, when we talk about nature versus urban experience, the environments we exist in today are increasingly a mix of both urban and nature. And individuals live within complex socio-cultural environmental systems with circles of influence on safety and health that are embedded within each other, from the family out to neighborhood, regional, national, and global scale. And as some of my JPB colleagues have laid out in their work, social and environmental factors interact in complex ways throughout the life course to affect biological and behavioral responses that can then lead to positive or negative outcomes as it relates to mental and physical health. So this includes the toxic interaction of social stress and environmental pollutants such as air pollution, but can also include positive outcomes that may come as a result of integrating and improving the physical environment through the introduction of accessible green space, for example. Now, the impacts of the natural environment on human well-being have been considered in a variety of ways for many hundreds and thousands of years, whether it be the ways in which nature is thought of as a component of therapeutic landscape design. A network centered on this is led by Dr. Naomi Sachs, as a healing power in hospital gardens, horticultural therapy, or of course, religious and spiritual traditions across the globe. A few years ago, a group of collaborators from the University of Washington and other institutions came together to develop a research agenda on nature contact and human health, as it's informed primarily by environmental psychology and approaches from public health. And we published a piece that lays out a research agenda. Broadly speaking, in this paper, we identified 7 research areas at the interface of nature contact and health. And I'll just say a few brief words about each domain. First, we need studies that help explain how nature contact benefits health. What are the causal mechanisms at work, and how do they interact to produce a variety of different effects? Better understanding of these mechanisms will help us design and deliver benefits more effectively. So several theories have driven research in this field for some time now. The Kaplan's attention restoration theory posits that our directed attention is overtaxed and depleted in urban environments due to the need to block out distractions in order to focus. And natural environments provide an opportunity for a replenishment of this capacity. Dr. Roger Ulrich's stress reduction theory posits that our common evolutionary past as a species results in natural environments, most of them anyway, restoring us through an engagement of parasympathetic nervous system activity. This is the rest and digest system. Dr. Ming Kuo and researchers from the Shinrin-yoku tradition, known as forest bathing here, have focused on the ways in which enhanced immune function from nature exposure explains many observed benefits. Dr. Peter James and others have looked at the extent to which nature contact promotes physical activity. Dr. Venice Jennings writes about the importance of social cohesion that can come from interaction in urban green space. And of course, these explanations aren't mutually exclusive, nor are they exhaustive at all when it comes to mechanisms. We'll be getting into some other possibilities as well today. Second, what cues can we take from methodologies in exposure science and other realms, for example, the impacts of air pollution on health, and work towards a consistent way to quantify nature contact? For example, these methods may involve the use of satellite imagery and maps that capture the proximity of residences to green space, or a calculation of the total amount of green space around a point as a cumulative opportunity metric for exposure. We also need a specification of what we mean when we say exposure in each of these instances. For example, are we talking about visual stimuli or olfactory or auditory experiences? What are the characteristics of the human nature interaction, as Dr. Peter Kahn points to in his lab's work on interaction patterns? A recent meta-analysis from PNAS examined the impacts of sounds on stress and other aspects of health, as well as determining the degree to which national parks provided these benefits through soundscapes and how anthropogenic noise could interfere. So these results are important, not only in pointing to the benefits of natural sounds, but in the indication of the ways in which urban and human-generated noise may moderate the impacts of these sounds. And tools from air pollution exposure assessment can also be used to measure specific volatile organic compounds from forests, known as terpenes, as we're currently doing in the University of Washington's experimental forest with support from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health of the National Institutes of Health. Now, this pathway has been shown in the forest bathing literature to have anti-inflammatory effects, but a lot is not yet known about the mechanism underlying these effects and how they relate to the inhalation of terpenes. Third, how do we describe and study the impacts and effects of nature experience using the lens of epidemiology? So how is nature contact associated with specific health outcomes that are of importance to public health, such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression, anxiety, and also well-being and happiness? What forms of nature contact are most beneficial to which types of outcomes? And as we've already begun to discuss, once we know more about the importance of these benefits, how are we dealing with diversity and equity issues regarding access to nature? How do we incorporate and provide amenities that are inclusionary regarding cultural preferences and uses of green space? And crucially, how are the effects of nature contact being incorporated into frameworks of environmental justice and health models that integrate interacting social and built environmental predictors of health? Fifth, how do technological representations of nature differ from actual nature? So this is important when we think through, can we use technological nature to study causal mechanisms within a laboratory setting? Does virtual reality have the same psychological impacts as real life experiences of nature? And there's work emerging on this as well. How do we value these benefits? Can we start to think about the health benefits of nature as a value for society that can be quantified in terms of reduced burden of illness and disease, for example? So ecosystem services, or the benefits that ecosystems and its processes provide for human well-being, have been framed in the ecology and policy discussion as services that stem from primarily biophysical processes, so water purification, flood protection, carbon sequestration. But there may be a way to begin to think of mental health in these terms as well and incorporate psychological ecosystem services into these types of assessments, where this element of nature's benefit may go otherwise unaccounted for. So we'll return to this in a bit. And lastly, if we can arrive at these values, how do we most effectively integrate them into planning and other policy and decision-making contexts? So The ways in which nature contact impacts mental health have been studied using a broad range of methodologies, from observational and cross-sectional approaches to natural and controlled experiments. And studies have taken place over a range of duration of exposure, over the course of minutes to hours to days and years. And the types of exposures can range from images on a computer monitor to window views of natural spaces to being present within them. They also vary across different types of nature. So each circle here represents the number of studies within each of these categories as of 2012. And since we wrote this review in 2012, there's been kind of an explosion in this area of work, but the general proportions remain about the same. And from our 2017 paper, we can see how contact with nature varies in frequency and spatial scale as well. So from potted plants to experiences in national parks. We can see there have been many cross-sectional studies with urban green space, focusing on an association of proximity to this green space with reported feelings of well-being or diagnosed disease. Other studies have used the controlled environment of a laboratory to examine the impacts of nature versus urban imagery through videos or pictures or virtual reality on stress recovery, including psychophysiological correlates of stress response and sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. Fewer studies have employed an experimental approach to the effects of presence within nature for a duration of minutes to hours. Those are the types of studies I've been conducting, and we find effects that are in line with these other types as well. And as we begin to understand these pathways, it's important to keep in mind that different kinds of nature impact different people differently, and context matters. So here by mediators, broadly speaking, I'm referring to pathways that may explain a causal relationship between two variables. And by moderators, I'm referring to characteristics of the individuals or populations that may modify the effects that come from nature contact. So as just one example, some recent work we've done shows that across 18 countries, people benefit less from nature contact when they're feeling social pressure to visit nature. And this goes even more strongly for individuals who are experiencing anxiety and depression disorders. These results, coupled with the additional finding that those with these common mental health conditions already visit nature at least as much, if not more than those without them, have implications for more thorough considerations of individuals' intrinsic and extrinsic motivations in green prescriptions and other nature interventions. And we have to look at temporal scale as well. So from chronic exposures to acute ones, from the buffering against the real-time experience of a stressor to the longer-term repercussions about recovery from them over time, and how the built environment plays a role in both. So what do we do with these kinds of results? Well, these findings, coupled with many, many other studies, employed a variety of methodologies, sample sizes, et cetera, and they've been building towards a sort of critical mass of evidence regarding the benefits of nature exposure. And this body of evidence sets the stage for some major questions upon which policymakers should be focusing when it comes to nature and psychological health, especially within the context of urban life. So here are just a couple of quick examples of these decision-making contexts. First, nature in schools. So green space, trees, bushes, other natural elements, there's a vast distribution of how much of this nature occurs within and around school grounds. And science is starting to show that this may have an impact on our children's brains and behavior. A study from 2015 in Barcelona showed that the more nature there was surrounding within school boundaries, the better the students performed on a working memory test over time. And another recent study found that window views matter for students. So after a mentally fatiguing test, students sat with views of either a wall, a building outside, or grass and trees. And those who had the nature view performed better on a working memory test and had decreased signs of stress in their physiology after only 10 minutes. So thinking about nature in schools is an important aspect to consider in the design of our cities. As a second example of a context for decision-making, we need to focus on equity. So as we continue to show how nature benefits urbanites psychologically, we must address the unequal distribution of access to natural areas. And the picture here is concerning. As just one example, in a study of the UK population from 2010, researchers found that green space availability within a reasonable proximity to one's home decreased rapidly along with income. And in the US, the Trust for Public Land has been putting out excellent publications that document the size and quality of parks, as well as proximity to homes, and how this differs vastly depending upon race and income. And here are a couple of other examples from North America, illustrated through satellite pictures. And we haven't touched the colors in these pictures at all. They speak for themselves. Income in 2 neighboring parts of Oakland is highly associated with the amount of greenness near residences. And the same goes for these 2 nearby areas in Vancouver, Canada. The need to address this inequitable distribution of accessible nature becomes even more pressing when we see that some studies indicate those from lower socioeconomic situations may benefit even more from exposure to nature. So these studies have been cross-sectional for the most part, but in just one example here, researchers found that association with green space and a decrease in bad health was larger for those who were more economically deprived. Doctors Hendricks and Van Zandt point to the importance of bringing together research in environmental justice and social vulnerability to acknowledge the ways in which social processes, power, and privilege lead to the creation of built environments that are underserved and lack critical infrastructure for low-income communities and communities of color, and argue for the importance of an inclusive definition of critical infrastructure that includes green space and parks in planning decisions that address these unequal levels of management and protection. So with respect to nature and green space, these considerations led to an effort in which we gathered together close to 30 experts in the field, from psychologists to epidemiologists to ecologists, practitioners, leaders of NGOs, to think through some foundational steps of how we might start to model the relationships between nature contact and mental health using the ecosystem service paradigm we mentioned earlier. And this brought us to the formation of a framework for psychological ecosystem services. So this is the entire framework, and we'll drill down and go through each step in a bit more detail. First step, step 1, natural features. So here we consider and then characterize the elements of nature that are potentially influencing mental health. And this can include size, the total area, composition, properties of different types of natural elements, and spatial configuration, so degrees of fragmentation and connectivity of natural landscapes. Also here, other relevant natural attributes, they could include tree canopy density, vegetation structure, species composition, or biodiversity. Second step assesses exposure. So this is based on a broad term, and here refers to the amount of contact that an individual or population has with nature. So this includes residential proximity to nearby green space, cumulative opportunity metrics that we spoke about earlier, ability to travel outside city limits to larger areas of nature, and other considerations. And along with other factors, spatial configuration and composition should be considered when we're estimating nature exposure. So different shades of green here represent different types of nature. Clusters of open lawn, A to C, versus trees, D to F. And these are embedded within urban surroundings in different configurations. But despite these differences, all panels have the same total amount of nature, 34 street blocks. But we can see how the design of these spaces might impact passive and active exposure to the natural areas. The model should also account for the socio-demographic, cultural, perceptual, attitudinal, and behavioral differences that influence the tendency and ability to seek out and receive nature contact. So measurement approaches based on the location alone can fail to account for differences in exposure that are due to factors such as access to transportation corridors, time demands, income disparities, discrimination, and safety. The next step in the model is to consider the types of nature interactions and experiences that occur within nature exposure, with each nature exposure. So this can include this consideration of interactions we mentioned, the documentation of different patterns of interactions with nature, or a kind of dose approach. So measurements that move from exposure to absorbed dose depending on behavior and other considerations. And fourth, the effects of nature exposure will also vary. So cognitive function, mood, stress reduction. Some will relate to psychological well-being. Others will relate to relevant factors for the onset of disease. They will also depend on socioeconomic status, age, gender, other personal characteristics like preferences for nature, and of course, the ways in which people feel welcomed or discriminated against while in natural environments. So here we see the conceptual illustration of how different groups respond differently across different outcomes to different amounts of nature experience. So with this framework, we can imagine potential practical applications as the evidence base builds. Now, of course, this model is not something that should be applied from afar or without considerations about specific places and social contexts. It's crucial that these decisions are made in close collaboration and partnerships with community members and groups and are responsive to the needs and desires of the people living within the areas themselves. And along with this comes a critical need to deal with green gentrification and displacement forces that come with green development. This must be tracked and addressed consistently as well. It's important to note the limitations of the evidence base today, as well as the capacity and opportunity to integrate existing evidence into predictions using a conceptual model. So these limitations point to important areas of new research, moving beyond correlation to causal understanding of relationships, and a great challenge is to distinguish the nature experience signal from other, in many cases, stronger social and environmental predictors of health. But despite these limitations, I believe there's a strong need for this type of conceptual model. Planners and practitioners are increasingly demanding the ability to account for the co-benefits of green infrastructure and other choices related to the incorporation of green space in cities or increasing access to wilderness areas outside of them. The repercussions of these choices on mental health may add up to be quite significant on a population level, and a framework is needed for their consideration and integration into decision-making today that will have influence in the decades to come. So with these effects in mind, decision makers can decide how best to bring additional nature to people, even within cities, by expanding parks, bringing people to already existing urban nature by increasing access through bike trails and other means, or encouraging and removing barriers to visitation of nearby nature outside city limits. And given the emerging evidence base for the benefits of nature contact, greater effort should be made to increase access to nature to help address the significant health inequities that people from socially disadvantaged neighborhoods experience in contrast to their privileged counterparts. The research is advanced enough that we can say with some degree of certainty that in most cases, nature experience benefits mood, emotion regulation, and cognitive function for urbanites. And rapid change and degradation of natural landscapes across the globe provides critical context for the application of this knowledge. So in this way, we can recognize our natural systems as vital assets, account for the central roles these assets play in supporting human psychological well-being, and routinely incorporate these values into decision-making. This will be crucial and critical for us to consider as we think about how to bring people to nature. And as we progress in the science, we'll get better and better at quantifying, describing, and characterizing the benefits of these interventions on psychological health. So with that, I'd like to thank these groups and individuals for their support of this work, as well as you all for listening today.